My name is Georgia, 62 years old, and I raised my son Michael by myself after losing my husband when our boy was just 10. I put Michael through law school, and he's now a successful attorney married to Ivy, my daughter-in-law of 5 years. Our relationship has been strained since she entered our lives, but nothing prepared me for last Christmas dinner at their new mansion. When gifts were exchanged, everyone received lavish presents, except me. Ivy laughed and said, "Oh, we must have misplaced yours." What they didn't know was that while they thought I was just a simple former teacher living in an old house, I had secretly built a $15 million real estate empire, and I was about to reveal everything. If you're watching this video, I'd love to know where you're from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. This story about keeping your dignity when others try to diminish you might just give you the courage to stand tall in your own difficult family situations. I wasn't always a secret millionaire. Far from it. For most of my adult life, I was an elementary school teacher who loved working with third graders. I met my husband Robert during my second year of teaching when he came to speak to my class about architecture. He was passionate about his work, drawing building sketches for the children and explaining how mathematics helps create beautiful structures. After class, he asked me out for coffee, and that was the beginning of our love story. Robert and I married a year later in a simple ceremony at my parents' farmhouse in Vermont. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood and filled it with furniture from yard sales and discount stores. Robert's architecture practice was still growing, so we lived carefully within our means. When Michael was born, our little family felt complete. Those first 10 years were beautiful. Robert was a devoted father who built elaborate blanket forts in the living room and taught Michael how to draw perfect circles freehand. I cut back to part-time teaching to spend more time with our son. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough, and more importantly, we had each other. Then came that rainy October night. Robert was driving home from a client meeting when a drunk driver crossed the center line. The police said he died instantly. I was 38 years old, suddenly a widow with a 10-year-old son to raise alone. The first few months after Robert's death passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, paperwork, and trying to help Michael understand why his father wasn't coming home. Friends brought casseroles and offered help, but eventually they returned to their own lives, leaving us to find our new normal. Robert had a life insurance policy worth $150,000. It seemed like a large sum at first, but as I looked at our mortgage, Michael's future education, and the decades stretching ahead of us, I realized it wouldn't be enough if I simply put it in a savings account. I needed to make this money grow. I had no background in finance or investing. My degree was in elementary education, and until Robert's death, he had handled most of our financial planning. But necessity is a powerful teacher. I began reading everything I could find about personal finance and investing. I checked out books from the library, attended free workshops at the community center, and spent hours on early internet forums learning from others. 6 months after Robert's death, I saw a flyer for a weekend seminar on real estate investing at the local community college. The fee was $250, a significant amount for us at the time, but something told me it would be worth it. That weekend changed the trajectory of my life. The instructor, a woman named Eleanor, who had built her own real estate business after a divorce, left her nearly homeless, spoke about real estate in a way that made sense to me. She explained how property could generate both passive income through rentals and long-term wealth through appreciation. Most importantly, she broke down the steps to get started in a way that seemed approachable, even for someone with limited capital. Start small, she advised. Look for distressed properties in decent neighborhoods. Learn basic repairs yourself to save money. And never, ever get emotionally attached to an investment property. After the seminar, I spent 3 months researching our local real estate market. I drove through neighborhoods on weekends, with Michael noting houses that looked neglected. I attended open houses to learn what features buyers valued. I made friends with a retired contractor at our church who agreed to teach me basic renovation skills. When I felt ready, I used $40,000 of the insurance money as a down payment on a small, foreclosed 2-bedroom house about 15 minutes from our home. It needed significant cosmetic work, but had good bones. For the next 6 months, every evening after teaching and putting Michael to bed, I would go to that house and work until midnight, painting walls, replacing fixtures, refinishing cabinets, and installing new flooring with skills learned from library books and early YouTube videos. I remember standing in that first property, after finishing the renovations, looking at my paint-spattered hands and feeling a mixture of exhaustion and pride. I had taken a neglected house and made it a home someone would love. I listed it for rent and found tenants. Within a week, a young couple expecting their first child. The rental income covered the mortgage, with $300 left over each month, money I immediately put into a fund for my next property. Michael was curious about my new project, but more concerned with adapting to life without his father. I explained that I was fixing up a house to rent out, just a small investment for our future. He helped occasionally, learning to paint walls and replace light fixtures alongside me. I was careful not to let this new venture take away from our time together. We still had our Friday movie nights, weekend hikes, and I never missed his baseball games. 3 years after buying that first property, I had saved enough from my teaching salary and rental income to purchase a second house. This one, a small 3-bedroom with water damage in the kitchen and primary bathroom. The pattern continued: buy, renovate, rent, save, repeat. By the time Michael was preparing for college, I owned 5 properties, generating enough rental income to cover their mortgages and provide an additional $2,500 monthly. This was the point when I had to make a decision about transparency with Michael. He was 17, preparing to leave for college, and believed we were getting by on my teacher's salary and careful budgeting. He had been accepted to several good schools, but was focused on state universities with scholarships to minimize cost. "Mom, I got accepted to Harvard," he told me one evening, the prestigious letter in his hand. "But I'm not going to put that burden on us. The scholarship at State U covers almost everything." That moment tested my resolve. I could have told him then about the real estate business that had grown enough to easily afford Harvard. Instead, I made a decision that would shape our relationship for years to come. "You earned that Harvard acceptance with your hard work," I told him. "We'll find a way to make it happen." We took out student loans in his name for part of the tuition, and I told him I would handle the rest through a combination of my savings, a small inheritance from a recently deceased aunt, a fiction, and a second job. Also not true. In reality, I liquidated one of my properties to pay for his first 2 years, then used the growing rental income for the remainder. Why the deception? I wanted Michael to develop his own work ethic, to value what he earned himself, rather than relying on family wealth. I had seen too many of his peers coasting on their parents' money, lacking the drive and resilience that comes from making your own way. More selfishly, perhaps, I enjoyed the independence my secret success gave me. For the first time in my life, I answered to no one about my financial decisions. As Michael progressed through college and then law school, my real estate empire grew steadily. I finally quit teaching when he was in his second year of law school, telling him I was ready for early retirement on my modest pension. In reality, I was now managing 15 properties and needed the time to expand my business. I established a property management company under an LLC with a name unconnected to me, Mountain Vista Properties, which allowed me to remain anonymous in my transactions. I hired a small staff who knew me only as the owner, who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. By the time Michael graduated from law school, my portfolio had grown to 20 properties, worth approximately $7 million. When Michael landed his first job at a prestigious Boston law firm, I was bursting with pride. He had done it entirely on his own merits, through his own hard work and determination. He found a nice apartment in the city, bought a sensible car, and began his career without knowing his mother could have purchased his apartment building outright if she'd wanted to. I continued living in the same house where Michael grew up, driving my 10-year-old sedan and dressing in clothes from department store sales. My few indulgences were hidden from view: rare first edition books, anonymous donations to educational charities, and occasional luxury travel where I wouldn't be recognized. By the time Michael met Ivy, 12 years after Robert's death, my little real estate venture had transformed into an empire worth nearly $12 million, encompassing 28 properties across 3 states, managed through a complex structure of LLCs that all traced back to Mountain Vista Properties, with me as the sole owner. I had plans to expand further, eyeing commercial properties and even a small apartment complex. And through it all, not even my son knew I was anything more than a retired school teacher, living comfortably but modestly on my pension and some prudent investments from his father's life insurance money. Little did I know that Ivy's arrival in our lives would eventually force my hand and bring my carefully constructed secret empire into the light. When Michael first mentioned Ivy, I could hear the excitement in his voice. He had been at his law firm for just over 2 years, making a name for himself in corporate law, when he called me on a Wednesday evening, speaking faster than usual. "Mom, I met someone," he said. "Her name is Ivy Preston. She works in the marketing department at Crawford and Williams, one of our firm's biggest clients. We've been talking at corporate events for months, but I finally asked her to dinner last week, and, well, she's amazing." I was thrilled. Michael had dated throughout college and law school, but never seemed to find someone special. At 29, he was established in his career and ready for a meaningful relationship. I listened as he described Ivy's accomplishments: degrees from Dartmouth and Wharton, a rapid rise through the marketing ranks, her volunteer work with arts organizations in Boston. "When can I meet her?" I asked. "Actually, I was hoping to bring her home for dinner next weekend. Are you free on Saturday?" I spent that week preparing. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, planned a menu of my best dishes, and even bought a new tablecloth for the occasion. I wanted Ivy to feel welcome and to see the warm home where Michael had grown up. The moment they arrived, I sensed something was off. Ivy was undeniably beautiful, tall and slender, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and an expensive-looking cream silk blouse, paired with tailored slacks. But when she stepped into our modest foyer, I caught the quick scan of her eyes, the slight tightening of her lips, before she arranged her features into a polite smile. "Mrs. Matthews, what a pleasure to finally meet you," she said, air kissing near my cheek rather than embracing me. "Michael speaks so highly of you. Please call me Georgia," I replied, leading them into the living room. I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who put that smile on my son's face. Ivy perched on the edge of our comfortable but worn sofa, her posture rigid as she placed her designer handbag carefully beside her. "What a cozy home. You've lived here since Michael was born." "Even before that," I said proudly. "Robert and I bought this place when we got married. It's seen a lot of love and life." "Mom's very attached to this house," Michael interjected, a note of apology in his voice that I'd never heard before. "We've talked about her upgrading to something newer, but you know how it is with sentimental value." I looked at him surprised. We'd never had such a conversation. Throughout dinner, Ivy was polite but distant. She complimented my cooking but ate sparingly. She asked questions about my teaching career and nodded at appropriate intervals, but seemed to lose interest in my answers midway through. When I brought out photo albums to show her pictures of Michael growing up, she glanced at them briefly before steering the conversation back to their life in Boston. "We've just been invited to join the Beacon Hill Arts Committee," she told me. "It's quite exclusive, mostly old Boston families and corporate executives. Michael's firm is very pleased with the connection." "That sounds lovely," I said, noting how Michael beamed at her words. "Michael has always appreciated art. He took every class the community center offered when he was young." "Community center classes?" Ivy laughed lightly. "How charming. Well, he'll need to develop more sophisticated tastes now. The committee hosts gallery openings and private viewings with contemporary artists." After they left that evening, I sat in my quiet house, replaying the interaction. Something about Ivy bothered me, but I couldn't quite place it. Was it her subtle condescension, the way she seemed to be molding Michael into someone different? Or was I simply being an overprotective mother, reluctant to see my son grow into a life so different from the one we'd shared? I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. First meetings can be awkward, and perhaps she was simply nervous about making a good impression. Over the next few months, I saw how Michael changed in Ivy's presence. He began referencing exclusive restaurants and events, dropping names of important people they'd met, describing weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard with her family. When he visited alone, he was more like his old self, but there was a new restlessness to him, a slight embarrassment about our simple home and lifestyle that had never been there before. 6 months after they began dating, Michael and Ivy invited me to dinner at an expensive restaurant in Boston to meet her parents. The Prestons were immediately intimidating. Richard, a banking executive with old family money, and Catherine, a socialite who chaired multiple charity boards. They greeted me with the same polite distance their daughter had displayed, quickly steering the conversation toward topics that highlighted the differences in our backgrounds. "Georgia Michael tells us you were a school teacher," Catherine said, somehow making my career choice sound like an eccentric hobby. "How fulfilling that must have been." "It was," I replied simply. "Helping children discover their potential is incredibly rewarding." "Indeed," Richard nodded absently. Our Ivy considered teaching briefly, as a professor, of course, but her talents were better suited to the corporate world. Throughout dinner, I noticed the meaningful glances between Ivy and her mother, the way they subtly directed the conversation to emphasize their family's connections and status. Michael seemed eager to impress them, laughing too loudly at Richard's mediocre jokes and repeatedly mentioning his recent successes at the firm. As we waited for dessert, Catherine turned to Michael. So, have you had a chance to look at those apartment listings I sent? The Fairmont building rarely has openings, and Harrison could help push your application through. Michael glanced at me quickly before responding. Not yet, but we'll definitely consider it. My lease isn't up for a few months. You can never start too early in this market, Richard advised. Besides, you're still in that starter neighborhood. A man of your professional stature should be in a more appropriate location. I stayed silent, realizing they were actively working to move Michael into their world. A world where his humble beginnings with me would become an awkward footnote rather than the foundation of his character. After that dinner, Michael and Ivy's relationship accelerated. They were always attending some gala or benefit, always surrounded by her friends and family. My invitations to them became less frequent and were often declined due to their busy social calendar. When they did visit, Ivy would make subtle comments about my house, my clothes, my simple lifestyle. "This kitchen is so vintage," she remarked once. "Have you ever thought about updating it? Even simple changes like replacing these laminate countertops with granite would make such a difference." "It works perfectly well for me," I replied. "I prefer to spend my retirement fund on experiences rather than things." She exchanged a look with Michael that clearly said, "See what I have to work with." The most revealing moment came about a year into their relationship. They had visited for Sunday lunch, and Ivy had stepped outside to take a phone call. I was in the kitchen, starting on the dishes, when I overheard Michael's voice from the living room, apparently on his own call. "No, we're at my mom's place," he was saying, his voice low. "I know it's not what you're used to." "Yes, she still drives that old Toyota. I've tried to talk to her about updating her lifestyle, but she's stuck in her ways. I know it's embarrassing, but what can I do? She's my mother." I stood, frozen by the sink, the water running unnoticed over my hands. My son was embarrassed by me, by our home, by the life we had built together. The realization stung more deeply than I could have imagined. When they announced their engagement 2 months later, I smiled and celebrated with them, keeping my reservations to myself. Michael was a grown man, making his own choices. If he loved Ivy, I would try my best to welcome her into our family, despite the growing evidence that she saw me as an inconvenience to be managed rather than family to be embraced. The wedding was an elaborate affair at the Preston family's country club, with over 300 guests, most of whom I'd never met. I was seated at a table far from the main wedding party, with distant Preston relatives who seemed unsure why they were placed with me. My role in the ceremony had been minimized. No mother-son dance, no speech, just a brief escort down the aisle at the beginning that felt more obligatory than meaningful. For a gift, I had given them a hand-painted ceramic serving set, made by a local artist, something special, but within the means of a retired teacher. When they opened it at the gift display, Ivy's smile had tightened as she murmured, "How unique," before quickly moving on to open a crystal vase from one of her mother's friends. After the wedding, their visits became even rarer. Michael called occasionally, but our conversations were superficial, focused on his work successes and their social engagements. When I asked about visiting their new condominium in an exclusive Boston neighborhood, there were always reasons to postpone. They were redecorating, their schedule was too busy. It wasn't a good time. I could have revealed my financial situation, then shown them that I wasn't the struggling retired teacher they assumed. I could have written a check for $1 million as a wedding gift and watched their jaws drop in shock. But something held me back. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps a nagging desire to see if my son would eventually stand up for me, choose me, despite my perceived lack of status. Instead, I continued my quiet accumulation of wealth, adding 4 more properties to my portfolio in the year following their wedding, bringing my total assets to nearly $13 million. And I waited, observing the increasingly troubling dynamic developing in my relationship with my son and his new wife. The first 3 years of Michael and Ivy's marriage were marked by a steady erosion of my place in my son's life. Each family gathering became an exercise in subtle humiliation, each interaction with Ivy a carefully choreographed reminder of my perceived inferiority in their world. There was the Thanksgiving dinner at their condominium, where I arrived to find I was seated at the far end of the table, separated from Michael by Ivy's college friends. When I brought homemade pumpkin bread, a recipe Michael had loved since childhood, Ivy placed it in the kitchen rather than on the elaborately decorated table, explaining, "We've already got the catered desserts arranged just so." There was my 61st birthday, which Michael completely forgot until I received a hastily purchased gift card 3 days later, accompanied by a text message explaining they had been swamped with charity events. There was the 4th of July barbecue at the Preston summer home, where Catherine looked me up and down and said, "Oh, Georgia, did you not get the memo about the blue and white dress code? Never mind, you can sit in the back row for the family photo. The caterers are wearing different colors, too." Each slight was small enough that objecting would have made me seem petty or oversensitive. Each time Michael either didn't notice or chose not to defend me, laughing uncomfortably or quickly changing the subject when tensions arose. I remember one particularly painful incident during a family dinner at an upscale restaurant to celebrate Richard Preston's birthday. I had worn my nicest dress, a simple but elegant navy blue sheath I'd purchased specially for the occasion. As we were being seated, I overheard Catherine whisper to Ivy, "Couldn't you have taken her shopping? That dress looks like it came from a department store clearance rack." "I tried," Ivy whispered back. "She's impossible to help. No sense of style whatsoever." Later that same evening, when conversation turned to travel plans, Richard mentioned their upcoming family trip to the Amalfi Coast. "We've rented a villa for 2 weeks," Catherine explained. "Just family, of course." When I looked at Michael questioningly, he avoided my eyes and said nothing, making it clear that family did not include me. The most revealing incidents, however, were the ones where I glimpsed Ivy's true attitude when she thought I couldn't hear, like the time I arrived early for a brunch at their condominium and overheard her in the hallway outside their door speaking to Michael. "Your mother is early again. I've told you to be specific about arrival times with her. Now she'll be underfoot while the caterers are still setting up." Her voice was sharp, annoyed. "And please, make sure she doesn't start telling those tedious stories about your childhood. The Aldens are coming, and they're important clients for Daddy." Or the Christmas Eve, 4 years into their marriage, when I was staying in their guest room. I had gotten up late at night for a glass of water and heard them arguing in their bedroom. "I don't see why we had to invite her for all 3 days," Ivy was saying. "Christmas dinner would have been more than enough. Now she's here watching us open family gifts tomorrow morning, too. She's my mother, Ivy. She doesn't have anyone else," Michael responded, his voice tired. "That's hardly our fault, is it? If she had made more of an effort to have a life, maybe she wouldn't be so dependent on you. It's embarrassing how she clings." I stood there in the dark hallway, the sting of her words bringing tears to my eyes. Is that how my son saw me now, as clingy, embarrassing, dependent? I who had raised him alone, who had built a multi-million-dollar business while he was none the wiser, who had deliberately stepped back. To let him forge his own path, I returned to the guest room, without my water, lying awake for hours, wondering how we had reached this point. In the morning, I plastered on a smile and pretended I had heard nothing, accepting my small, impersonal Christmas gifts from them. A scented candle from a department store, and a gift card to a chain restaurant, with appropriate gratitude. It was during the following year that I began to notice signs of financial strain in Michael and Ivy's carefully curated perfect life. There were offhand comments about the stock market's poor performance, mentions of clients who hadn't renewed contracts, a new hesitance about picking up dinner checks that had never been there before. Then came the day I stopped by their condominium unannounced, something I rarely did, but had risked because I was in Boston for a dental appointment and had brought some of Michael's favorite cookies. The concierge called up, and Ivy answered, clearly annoyed, but unable to refuse my visit without seeming rude. When I entered their impeccably decorated living room, I noticed papers hastily swept into a folder on the coffee table. As Ivy went to make coffee, my eyes caught a glimpse of what appeared to be past due notices and a letter from a bank regarding a mortgage application. Later that week, I had my property manager look into some public records. What she found confirmed my suspicions. Michael and Ivy had recently purchased a vacation home in the Berkshires, taking on a substantial mortgage that, combined with their condominium payments and lavish lifestyle, was stretching their finances dangerously thin. Additionally, it appeared Richard Preston's bank had faced significant losses in the recent financial downturn, potentially affecting the family's previously solid financial position. I debated whether to approach Michael about what I'd learned. Would he be receptive to financial advice from his supposedly struggling mother? Would offering help reveal too much about my own situation before I was ready? While I considered my options, another troubling development emerged. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I learned that Ivy had been asking questions about me. Not casual inquiries, but pointed questions about my finances. Whether I had investments beyond my teacher's pension, whether Robert might have left insurance money I'd never mentioned. She had even asked our old neighbor if I had ever discussed inheritance expectations. Her sudden interest in my financial situation made me uneasy. Then, about 6 months ago, I received an unexpected call from my bank. Someone claiming to be my financial advisor had called, attempting to get information about my accounts. The bank, following proper security protocols, had refused to provide any information without my authorization. I knew immediately what was happening. Ivy was digging, looking for assets, perhaps hoping to find resources to help with their overextended finances. Her timing couldn't have been worse from her perspective. I was in the final stages of negotiating the purchase of my largest acquisition, yet a small apartment building that would push my total holdings over the $15 million mark. My suspicions were confirmed a month later, when I overheard a conversation never meant for my ears. I had arrived early for dinner at Michael and Ivy's condominium, let in by the concierge who knew me from previous visits. Instead of announcing myself immediately, I paused in the entryway, hearing raised voices from the study. "We need to consider all options, Michael," Ivy was saying. "Your mother's house must be worth at least $400,000 in this market. If we could convince her to sell and move into Cedar Grove retirement community, we could manage her funds as her power of attorney." "I'm not putting my mother in a retirement home, Ivy. She's only 62 and in perfect health," Michael protested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Be realistic. That house is too large for her to maintain properly, and the stairs will become a hazard as she ages. Cedar Grove has those nice one-bedroom apartments and structured activities, she'd be much better off there, and we could use the house proceeds to help with our situation. Even if that were true, the money from the house would be hers, not ours. Don't be naive, Michael. Once she settled in Cedar Grove, we'd have influence over her finances for her own good. That equity could help us through this rough patch, and eventually, it would be your inheritance anyway. We're just accelerating the timeline a bit. I felt physically ill, listening to them discuss disposing of my home and controlling my non-existent retirement fund while I was still very much alive and well. More distressing than Ivy's scheming was Michael's weak resistance, his failure to shut down the conversation immediately and definitively. I slipped back out of the condominium, unseen, texted that I was running late due to traffic, and drove aimlessly for 30 minutes to compose myself. When I returned, I was the picture of ignorant contentment, giving no indication of what I had overheard. But inside, something had hardened. A decision was forming. For years, I had kept my wealth secret to ensure Michael developed his own work ethic and independence. I had endured Ivy's condescension and the Prestons' dismissal under the guise of being a modest, retired teacher. I had watched my relationship with my son deteriorate as he embraced their world of status and appearances. But now, they were actively plotting to take advantage of my perceived vulnerability. The time for secrecy was coming to an end. I needed to protect myself, and perhaps in the process, give my son a much-needed wake-up call about the woman he had married. I began preparing methodically. I met with my lawyer to update my will and ensure all my business affairs were in perfect order. I gathered documentation of my property holdings investment accounts and business structure. I had my accountant prepare a comprehensive summary of my net worth, now standing at just over $15 million. And I waited for the right moment, which arrived sooner than I expected, in the form of an invitation to Christmas dinner at Michael and Ivy's newly purchased vacation home in the Berkshires, the very home that was stretching their finances to the breaking point. "We'd love you to join us for Christmas this year," Michael said when he called. "Ivy's parents and her sister's family will be there. It'll be the first holiday in our new place." "I'd love to come," I said, already formulating my plan. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," he replied, the forced cheerfulness in his voice suggesting this invitation hadn't been his idea alone. "And maybe one of your apple pies, for old time's sake." That small request, a reference to our family tradition, before Ivy gave me a flicker of hope that my son wasn't entirely lost to me. Of course, I promised. I wouldn't miss it. As I hung up, I knew that this Christmas dinner would be unlike any other in our family history. After 5 years of subtle humiliation and growing disrespect, after discovering their plans to manipulate me for financial gain, I was finally ready to reveal my secret empire. The only question remaining was exactly how and when to drop the bombshell that would change our family dynamic forever. The drive to the Berkshires on Christmas Eve morning was peaceful, the landscape transformed by a recent snowfall that blanketed the fields and forests in pristine white. I had my apple pie carefully packed on the back seat, along with a small overnight bag and a nondescript manila envelope containing the documents that would soon upend my son's perception of his simple mother. Michael and Ivy's new vacation home was exactly what I expected. A sprawling, modern interpretation of a mountain lodge with soaring ceilings, walls of glass overlooking the snow-covered landscape, and an air of calculated, rustic luxury. The circular driveway was filled with expensive cars, my modest Toyota Camry looking decidedly out of place among them. As I gathered my things from the car, I saw Ivy watching from one of the large windows, her expression shifting quickly, from annoyance to a practiced smile, when she realized I'd noticed her. By the time I reached the front door, Michael was there to greet me, giving me a quick hug that felt more obligatory than affectionate. "Mom, glad you made it. The roads weren't too bad." "Not at all," I replied. "Your directions were perfect. What a beautiful home, Michael." "Let me show you around," he offered, taking my overnight bag, but leaving me to carry the pie. "Everyone's already here." The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, a massive stone fireplace, furnishings that managed to look both casual and exorbitantly expensive. The great room opened onto a professional-grade kitchen, where a catering staff was busily preparing what appeared to be an elaborate Christmas Eve dinner. "We've put you in the blue guest room," Michael explained, leading me down a hallway. "It's the smallest, but it has a nice view of the woods." The smallest guest room was still larger than my bedroom at home, decorated in various shades of blue, with a queen-sized bed and a small sitting area near the window. There was a tiny ensuite bathroom, which Michael pointed out was just a powder room, but there's a full guest bath down the hall you can use for showering. "This is lovely," I assured him, setting down my purse and the manila envelope on the bed. "Thank you for having me." "Of course," he said, glancing at his watch. "We're having drinks in the great room at 6, dinner at 7. Dress is, well, festive, but nice." The subtle warning about my attire wasn't lost on me. "I brought something appropriate," I promised, thinking of the simple but elegant black dress packed in my bag, one of the few designer pieces I owned, though Michael wouldn't recognize the label. Left alone, I took a moment to center myself. Tonight would change everything between us. For better or worse, after this Christmas, Michael would know exactly who his mother was. Not just the devoted teacher and mother he'd grown up with, but the shrewd businesswoman who had built an empire while he wasn't looking. When I emerged for pre-dinner drinks, the great room had been transformed. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace. The lights had been dimmed to a flattering glow, and holiday music played softly through hidden speakers. The Preston family was already assembled, cocktails in hand, dressed in what could only be described as casual luxury. Cashmere sweaters, perfectly tailored slacks, subtle but expensive jewelry. Ivy, resplendent in a deep green silk blouse and cream-colored wool pants, was holding court near the fireplace. She barely acknowledged my entrance, continuing her story about their difficulty finding the perfect dining table for the space. Catherine Preston, elegant in gray cashmere, gave me a cool nod. Richard Preston was deep in conversation with a man I assumed was Ivy's brother-in-law, both clutching tumblers of amber liquid. Michael approached with a glass of white wine, which he handed to me without asking my preference. "You remember everyone, right? Mom, Ivy's sister, Melissa, and her husband, Dean, are here with their kids, who are already in bed." The evening proceeded predictably. I was largely ignored during the pre-dinner conversation, seated at the far end of the table during the meal, and generally treated as an afterthought by everyone except Michael, who made occasional awkward attempts to include me. The dinner itself was magnificent, course after course of gourmet cuisine prepared by the hired chef. As we ate, the conversation revolved around topics designed to exclude me. Reminiscences about Preston family vacations, discussions of their country club's upcoming renovations, gossip about social connections I didn't share. When I did attempt to join the conversation, recounting a charming story about Michael's childhood Christmas pageant, Ivy smoothly interrupted, redirecting attention to the exquisite table settings. "We had these linens hand-embroidered in Italy," she explained, running her fingers along the edge of the tablecloth. "The pattern is based on antique textiles Catherine found in Provence last summer." "They're beautiful," I said sincerely. "You have excellent taste, Ivy." "It comes naturally," Catherine interjected with a meaningful look. "Good taste is usually inherited, don't you think?" The implication was clear. My son had married into refinement he would never have found in his own background. After dessert, we moved back to the great room for coffee and digestives. The conversation turned to the upcoming year's travel plans. "We've booked the chalet in Gstaad for February," Richard announced. 2 weeks of the best skiing in Europe. "You and Michael will join us, of course, Ivy." "Absolutely," Ivy confirmed. "Michael's arranged to work remotely for part of it. We couldn't miss the Arnold's annual party at their neighboring chalet." I sipped my coffee, silently noting the flicker of tension in Michael's expression. Given what I knew about their financial situation, an expensive Swiss ski vacation seemed imprudent at best. "And Georgia, what are your plans for the winter?" Catherine asked, her tone suggesting she was making a polite effort to include me. "Perhaps a seniors cruise? I hear they offer excellent discounts after the holidays." "Actually, I haven't decided yet," I replied mildly. "I like to keep my options open. Mother prefers quiet time at home." Michael interjected a hint of apology in his voice. "She's never been much of a traveler." "Because teachers' pensions don't stretch to international travel," Ivy said with a laugh that others around the room echoed. "But there are lovely bus tours for seniors that go to Atlantic City or Niagara Falls that might be nice." I merely smiled, letting the condescension roll off me. My moment hadn't yet arrived. It was Richard who eventually suggested exchanging gifts. "No reason to wait until morning for the adults," he declared. "Let's do it now, while the children are asleep." Ivy clapped her hands with manufactured excitement. "Perfect. I'll get everything from under the tree." What followed was a carefully choreographed display of conspicuous generosity. Richard and Catherine presented Michael and Ivy with a pair of antique silver candelabras that had been in the family for generations. Melissa and Dean received a gift certificate for a weekend at an exclusive spa. Ivy's sister gave her parents tickets to the symphony. Then came Michael and Ivy's gifts to the others. For her parents, an original artwork from a trendy Boston gallery. For her sister and brother-in-law, matching luxury watches. For Richard specifically, a rare first edition book he had apparently coveted. I sat quietly, observing the exclamations of delight. The air kisses the stories of how difficult it had been to find just the perfect gift for each person. My small offering, hand-knit scarves for everyone, remained in my overnight bag, suddenly seeming too humble to present in this showcase of extravagance. Finally, after every other gift had been opened and admired, Ivy turned to me with a theatrical look of concern. "Oh," she exclaimed, "I just realized we don't have anything for Georgia under the tree. Michael, did we misplace Mom's gift?" Michael looked genuinely confused and embarrassed. "I thought, didn't we get the—" He trailed off, clearly unable to remember any gift purchased for his mother. "Oh dear," Ivy continued, not bothering to hide her amusement. "We must have misplaced yours with all the holiday chaos and the move into the new house, things got a bit disorganized. I'm sure we'll find it eventually. The room fell into an awkward silence, broken only by Catherine's poorly disguised snort of laughter. Michael looked mortified, but said nothing in his mother's defense. It was the moment I had been waiting for, though I hadn't anticipated it would come in quite this fashion. I set down my coffee cup carefully and smiled. "That's perfectly all right," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I actually got myself something quite special this year. I'd be happy to share it with all of you." Ivy's smug expression faltered slightly at my lack of embarrassment. "Oh, yes, let me get it. It's in my room." I rose and walked unhurriedly to the guest room, feeling their curious gazes on my back. In the room, I took a deep breath, gathered the manila envelope from the bed, and returned to the great room where an uncomfortable silence had fallen. "Here we are," I said cheerfully, settling back into my seat. I opened the envelope and removed a thick stack of documents tied with a festive red ribbon. "I've been working on this gift to myself for quite some time, about 20 years actually." "Mother, we don't need to do this now," Michael began, clearly thinking I was about to share some sentimental craft project that would further embarrass him in front of his in-laws. "No, I insist," I replied firmly. "It's actually quite relevant to all of you." I untied the ribbon with deliberate slowness. "You see, after Robert died, I needed to find a way to support Michael and myself. Teaching salary only goes so far, especially with college costs looming." "Mom, really, this isn't necessary," Michael interjected, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I continued as if he hadn't spoken. "So I took a portion of Robert's life insurance money and invested in my first rental property, a small, distressed 2-bedroom that I renovated myself in the evenings after teaching all day." The room had gone very still, all eyes now fixed on me with varying degrees of confusion. That first property led to a second, then a third. I discovered I had quite a knack for identifying undervalued real estate, for rehabilitation, for property management. I removed the top document from my stack and laid it on the coffee table. "This is the current portfolio summary for Mountain Vista Properties, LLC, my company." Michael stared at me, then at the paper, his expression uncomprehending. "Perhaps these numbers will make it clearer." I continued, laying down another document. "This is the current valuation of all holdings, 32 properties across 4 states, with a total market value of $15,342,000, net of outstanding mortgages and operational costs. That's an equity position of just under $11 million. The silence was absolute now. Ivy had gone pale, her perfectly manicured hand frozen in mid-air wineglass, forgotten. "Of course, that doesn't include the most recent acquisition," I added, enjoying the moment perhaps more than I should have. "This property, actually." Now it was Michael who went pale. "What?" I smiled and laid down another document. "Mountain Peak Holdings, a subsidiary of my main company, purchased this house 6 months ago from the developer. I'm your landlord, Michael. The mortgage you think you have is actually a lease-to-own agreement structured through a third-party management company I use for situations requiring discretion." Ivy made a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a cough. Richard Preston sat up straighter, his business instincts clearly engaged despite his shock. "That's not possible," Michael finally managed. "We have a mortgage. We signed papers with Eastern Bank." "Eastern Bank is merely the servicer," I explained gently. "The actual note holder is Mountain Peak Holdings, I could show you the full documentation, but I think this summary should suffice. I passed him another paper, this one showing the property transaction details, with his and Ivy's names clearly visible. The room erupted in confused exclamations and questions, everyone talking over each other. Catherine looked as though she might faint. Richard was demanding to see the paperwork more clearly. Ivy was shaking her head repeatedly, as if denial could change the reality before her. Michael just stared at me, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and what might have been the beginning of understanding. I waited for the initial chaos to subside before continuing. I've kept my financial situation private all these years for personal reasons. I wanted Michael to establish himself independently, to develop his own work ethic and sense of accomplishment without relying on family wealth. I looked directly at my son. I'm proud of what you've achieved on your own merits, Michael. That was always my intention. But why reveal this now? Richard Preston asked his banker's mind clearly, trying to assess the implications. Why the theatrics? I turned to him with a calm smile. Recent events have made it necessary for me to clarify my position. When one overhears discussions about being placed in a retirement home, so others can access the equity in one's modest house, it seems prudent to establish the actual parameters of the situation. Ivy's face drained of what little color remained. You heard? Yes, I said simply. I heard quite a bit, Ivy, about Cedar Grove Retirement Community, about becoming my power of attorney, about accelerating the timeline of Michael's inheritance. Michael looked stricken. Mom, that wasn't what it sounded like. Ivy was just exploring options for your long-term care. At 62, when I'm in perfect health, I raised an eyebrow. Let's not insult each other's intelligence, Michael. The plans being made were not for my benefit. I gathered my documents back into a neat stack. I'm not sharing this information to cause embarrassment or discord. I simply believe it's time for transparency. You should know who I am and what I've built. And perhaps, more importantly, you should understand that I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs, financial and otherwise. The silence that followed was profound. The Preston family seemed collectively unable to process this reversal of their understood reality. Michael continued to stare at the property summary in his hands, as if hoping the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. It was Ivy who recovered first, her social training kicking in despite the shock. Well, she said, her voice artificially bright, this is certainly unexpected. How resourceful you've been, Georgia. We had no idea you had such business acumen. Clearly, I replied with a small smile, and quite a secret to keep from your own son. Catherine added a note of accusation in her voice. Most mothers would want to share their success with their children. I turned to her, keeping my expression pleasant. Most mothers-in-law are treated as valued family members, rather than inconvenient appendages to be managed and minimized. We all make our choices about what we share and with whom. Catherine had the grace to look momentarily abashed, though she recovered quickly. Well, I'm sure we're all delighted to learn about your success. It certainly puts things in a different perspective. That it does, I agreed. And speaking of perspective, I should mention that I'll be restructuring some of my holdings in the coming year. This property, for instance, will likely be placed on the market. You're selling our house, Ivy exclaimed, panic replacing her forced composure. Your lease-to-own arrangement gives you first right of refusal, of course, I explained. At market value, which has increased approximately 12% since purchase. Alternatively, we could convert to a standard rental agreement, though the monthly payments would necessarily increase to reflect current market rates. Michael finally found his voice. "Mom, you can't just. This is our home." I looked at my son steadily. "Is it? You've been here less than 3 months, Michael. And given what I know about your current financial situation, the carrying costs of this property are already stretching you beyond reasonable limits." The stunned silence that followed confirmed my assessment. Richard Preston cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps this conversation should continue in private between family members." "I couldn't agree more," I replied, gathering my documents and standing. "Which is why I'll say goodnight now. Michael, we can discuss details tomorrow. I'll be leaving after breakfast." I walked calmly to my room, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing my composed facade to crack slightly. I hadn't anticipated how emotionally draining the confrontation would be, despite my careful preparation. The look of betrayal in Michael's eyes had cut deeper than I expected, but beneath the emotional turbulence was a sense of relief. The secret I'd carried for 20 years was finally in the open. For better or worse, my son now knew the truth about who his mother really was, and the Prestons would never again underestimate the retired school teacher they had so casually dismissed. I changed into my night clothes and slipped between the luxurious sheets of the guest bed, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Sleep came surprisingly easily, perhaps because for the first time in years, I was finally being my authentic self with the people closest to me. The real reckoning would come with the morning light. I woke early on Christmas morning, the winter sunlight filtering through the curtains of the blue guest room. The house was still quiet, suggesting I was the first one awake. After dressing in simple black slacks and a red sweater, festive but understated, I made my way to the kitchen, intending to make myself a cup of coffee before anyone else appeared. To my surprise, Michael was already there, sitting at the kitchen island, with a mug between his hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to the questions undoubtedly swirling in his mind. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red-rimmed from either lack of sleep or emotion, possibly both. "Merry Christmas," I said softly. He nodded, but didn't return the greeting. "There's coffee in the pot. The caterers won't be here until 9. I poured myself a cup and took a seat across from him, the granite island between us, like a physical manifestation of the distance that had grown between mother and son. For several minutes, we sat in silence, each waiting for the other to begin. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low and controlled. 20 years, Mom. You've been building this empire for 20 years, and you never said a word to me." "Yes," I acknowledged simply. "Why?" The single word contained a universe of hurt and confusion. I took a sip of coffee, gathering my thoughts. When I started, it was just a practical solution to a financial problem. How to stretch Robert's insurance money to give you the best possible future. By the time it grew into something significant, you were in college developing your own identity, your own path. That doesn't explain why you kept it secret, doesn't it? I set down my mug. "Michael, I watched what happened to many of your friends whose parents had money. The ones who never had to worry, who knew there was always a safety net. Some of them never developed resilience or self-reliance. Some never found their own purpose because they didn't need to." He frowned. "You didn't trust me to handle it well." "It wasn't about trust," I corrected gently. "It was about giving you the gift of self-made success, of knowing everything you achieved was through your own merit, not because of family connections or resources." Michael was silent for a moment, absorbing this. But after I was established in my career, after I had proven myself, By your standards, why continue the deception? This was harder to answer. I chose my words carefully. By then, patterns had been established. You had your life, I had mine. And then I met Ivy, he finished for me. Yes, I admitted. After you met Ivy, the dynamic changed. I watched how her family's status and wealth influenced your choices, your values. I saw you becoming embarrassed by your background, by me. Would knowing about my financial success have changed that? Perhaps. But it might also have simply accelerated the process of pulling you into their world completely. Michael flinched, unable to deny the truth in my observation. You could have trusted me with the information, let me make my own decisions. Perhaps that was my mistake, I conceded. But Michael, be honest. These past 5 years, would you have treated me differently if you'd known I was wealthy? Would Ivy? He couldn't meet my eyes, which was answer enough. The more important question, I continued, is why you allowed your wife and her family to treat me with such consistent disrespect. Why you stood by last night when I was deliberately excluded from the gift exchange. A calculated public humiliation. Now it was Michael's turn to stare into his coffee, shame evident in his posture. I don't have a good answer for that. I've been caught between worlds, wanting to please Ivy, to fit into her family, to be the man she thought she married. And that man couldn't have a simple middle-class mother who didn't fit the Preston mold. I finished for him. It sounds terrible when you put it like that. Because it is terrible, Michael. Not the part about me being hurt. I'm a grown woman and can handle social slights. The terrible part is what it says about the person you've become, the values you've adopted. He looked up at me, then, really seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. I'm sorry, Mom. I've been wrong about so many things. It was a start, but we both knew a simple apology couldn't erase years of behavior. Before I could respond, we heard movement upstairs. The house was beginning to wake up. We should continue this conversation later, I suggested. Somewhere private, Michael nodded, looking relieved at the temporary reprieve. There's a walking trail behind the house. Maybe after breakfast. That would be good. The kitchen soon filled with others. First, the catering staff arriving to prepare breakfast. Then, Melissa's children racing downstairs to see if Santa had come. Followed by the adults in various states of morning dishevelment, with the notable exception of Ivy, who appeared perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. The atmosphere was strained, to say the least. Catherine and Richard maintained a cold politeness, clearly still processing the revelations of the previous evening. Melissa and Dean seemed confused by the tension, but tried to focus on their children's Christmas excitement. Ivy alternated between frosty silence when looking at me and artificial warmth when addressing everyone else. After a breakfast that few of us actually ate, the children opened their presents from Santa with appropriate delight, temporarily lifting the awkward atmosphere. When they had finished and were absorbed in their new toys, Michael stood. "Mom and I are going to take a walk," he announced. "We'll be back in a bit." Ivy looked alarmed. "But we're supposed to do the family gift exchange in 20 minutes. The photographer is coming at 11. "The photographer can wait," Michael replied with unprecedented firmness. "This is important." I followed him to the mudroom, where we donned coats, boots, scarves, and gloves before stepping out into the crisp winter morning. The walking trail was beautiful, winding through snow-covered woods, the only sounds our footsteps crunching in the snow, and the occasional chirp of winter birds. We walked in silence for several minutes before Michael spoke again. "Are you really planning to sell this house That depends, I replied honestly. On what? On several things. Your financial situation, for one. This property is stretching your resources dangerously thin, Michael. The monthly payments, the maintenance costs, the property taxes. It's unsustainable at your current income level, even with Ivy's salary. He sighed, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. You're right, we're over-leveraged. Ivy insisted we needed a vacation home comparable to her parents', especially after her sister bought that place in the Hamptons. I knew it was a mistake, but I went along with it. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. You've always been financially responsible. Your father taught you better than this? Michael stopped walking, turning to face me fully. Because I've been trying to be someone I'm not. Someone who belongs in Ivy's world. Someone who impresses the Prestons and their social circle. Someone who cares about the right address and the right clubs and the right connections. He shook his head ruefully. And I've been failing at it spectacularly. We're drowning in debt, trying to maintain appearances. And Ivy? His expression darkened. Ivy believes the solution is to spend more, connect more, appear more successful, until actual success materializes. She doesn't understand the concept of living within one's means. And the discussions about moving me to Cedar Grove, about accessing the equity in my house, I kept my tone neutral, not accusatory. Michael had the grace to look deeply ashamed. That was Ivy's idea, but I didn't shut it down immediately like I should have. I'm so sorry, Mom. It was wrong on every level. We resumed walking, the path curving alongside a frozen stream. I won't sell this house, I said after a while. But we need to restructure the arrangement to something sustainable. And we need to establish some boundaries going forward. What kind of boundaries? Respect for one. I won't be treated as an inconvenient appendage to your life, Michael. Not by you, not by Ivy, not by the Prestons. If I'm to be part of your life in a meaningful way, it must be as an equal, not as someone to be managed or minimized. He nodded, accepting this. And the business, your properties. What happens with all of that? That's a longer conversation, I replied. I've been thinking about establishing a formal family, all office, perhaps bringing you in to learn the business if you're interested. But that would depend on several factors, including your commitment to rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. We had reached a small wooden bridge crossing the stream. Michael stopped again, looking out at the winter landscape. I don't know if Ivy can accept this new reality. She married the son of a school teacher, someone she could mold and guide into her world. Finding out her mother-in-law is actually wealthier than her family, that we've been living in a house you own. It's going to be difficult for her. That's for Ivy to work through, I said firmly. And for you to decide what kind of marriage and life you want going forward. I won't interfere with those choices, but I also won't pretend to be less than I am anymore. Michael was quiet for a long moment. I need to make some changes, he finally said. In my marriage, in my priorities, in how I've been living. Last night was clarifying. Seeing everything through your eyes, realizing how far I've drifted from the values you and Dad taught me. I reached out and squeezed his arm, feeling a cautious hope. It's never too late to course correct, Michael. Your father used to say that the true measure of a person isn't never making mistakes, but how they respond when those mistakes become clear. He managed a small smile at the mention of Robert. I remember he also used to say that integrity isn't what you do when everyone is watching, but the choices you make when no one would ever know. Like building a real estate empire while pretending to live on a teacher's pension. I suggested wryly. Michael actually laughed at that, the tension between us easing slightly. Point taken. We both have some integrity issues to work on, it seems. We turned back toward the house, walking side by side in a more comfortable silence. As the back of the large home came into view, Michael spoke again. What now? With everyone waiting inside. Now we go back to Christmas, I said simply. We open presents, we eat dinner, we make polite conversation. The deeper conversations, the real changes, those will take time. And Ivy, the Prestons? I shrugged. They'll adjust, or they won't. That's not something either of us can control, but I won't be diminished or disrespected in my own son's home ever again. On that, I'm quite firm. Michael nodded a new resolve in his expression. Understood and agreed. We re-entered the house to find a tableau of forced festivity. The children were playing with their toys. The adults were arranged artfully in the great room. The Christmas tree lights were twinkling, and a photographer was adjusting his equipment. Ivy hurried over as soon as we appeared. Finally, we've been waiting. The photographer has been here for 20 minutes. She looked at Michael expectantly. Everything sorted out. We've made a start, he replied neutrally. Mom and I have a lot more to discuss over the coming weeks. Ivy's smile faltered slightly. Wonderful. Well, we should get on with the family gifts before lunch. Everyone's waiting. The gift exchange was a strained affair, with everyone overcompensating for the previous night's awkwardness. Ivy had mysteriously found a gift for me overnight, an expensive but impersonal scarf that still had the price tag partially visible on the box. I accepted it with gracious thanks, not calling attention to the obvious last-minute purchase. When it came time for me to offer my gifts, I brought out the hand-knit scarves I'd made for everyone, each one carefully crafted in colors, chosen specifically for the recipient. To my surprise, Michael put his on immediately, wrapping it around his neck with a genuine smile. Just like the ones you used to make me every winter when I was growing up, he said, his voice warm with memory. I still have all of them. Ivy looked at her scarf with poorly concealed disdain, but Catherine surprised me by examining hers closely before saying, "This is beautiful workmanship, Georgia. You're quite talented." "Thank you," I replied, recognizing the small olive branch for what it was. I find knitting relaxing. The day proceeded with an uneasy truce. The catered Christmas lunch was delicious, the conversation carefully steered toward safe topics. The Prestons were coolly polite to me, clearly reassessing their understanding of the family dynamics. Ivy maintained her composure, but couldn't quite hide her discomfort whenever she looked at me. When it was time for me to leave in the afternoon, Michael walked me to my car, carrying my overnight bag. "Will you come back for New Year's?" he asked. "We're supposed to host a party, but we could cancel, have something smaller, just family. Let's talk after the holidays," I suggested. "We both need some time to process everything, but I'd like to have you visit me at home next week if you're willing. There's more I'd like to show you about the business." "I'd like that," he said, surprising me with a genuine hug before I got into my car. As I drove away, watching the large house recede in my rearview mirror, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief at finally unveiling my secret hope for rebuilding my relationship with my son on more honest terms. Uncertainty about what the future would hold for all of us. The empire I had built in secret was now in the open, for better or worse. The carefully constructed persona of Georgia, the modest retired teacher, had been replaced by Georgia, the successful businesswoman. It remained to be seen how this new reality would reshape our family dynamics. But one thing was certain. I would never again allow myself to be diminished or disrespected by anyone, not even for my son's sake. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but as I drove through the winter landscape toward home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The truth, as they say, had set me free. In the months following that revelatory Christmas, our family underwent a transformation as significant as the changing seasons. Winter's stark clarity gave way to spring's tentative renewal, which in turn blossomed into summer's full revelation, a fitting metaphor for the evolution of my relationship with Michael, and by extension, with Ivy. The week after Christmas, Michael came to my modest home as promised. He arrived without Ivy explaining that we needed this time to reconnect one-on-one. I led him to my small home office, where I'd prepared files documenting the full extent of my business operations. "I still can't believe you managed all this from this tiny room," he said, looking around at the simple desk, the filing cabinets, the older model computer. "Most of the actual business operations happen through my property management company's offices downtown," I explained. "But yes, this is where it all started. Late nights, researching properties after you went to bed, weekends, analyzing market trends while you were at baseball practice." I walked him through the growth of my portfolio, from that first small rental to the complex web of LLCs and holdings it had become. I showed him the organizational structure, the financing strategies, the tax planning that had allowed my wealth to grow so significantly while remaining below the radar. Michael, to his credit, was an attentive student. His legal background gave him an advantage in understanding the more complex aspects of my business structure. He asked intelligent questions, took copious notes, and seemed genuinely interested in learning every aspect of what I had built. "You're a financial genius, Mom," he said at one point, shaking his head in amazement. "All those years, I thought I was the successful one in the family, and you were running circles around most of the business clients at my firm." I smiled at the compliment, but corrected him gently. "Not a genius, just persistent and careful. And I had excellent timing in some of the markets. But thank you." That day marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. Over the following weeks, Michael visited regularly, sometimes for business discussions, sometimes just for dinner and conversation. We were rebuilding our connection on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had been missing for too long. Ivy was a more complicated matter. The revelation of my financial status had thrown her into a tailspin of conflicting emotions: embarrassment over her previous condescension, resentment at being deceived, and a calculating interest in how my wealth might benefit her and Michael going forward. Her initial approach was to pretend nothing had changed, inviting me to lunch with a synthetic warmth that rang hollow. "We should spend more time together, Georgia," she cooed across the table at an overpriced restaurant she'd selected. "I've always valued your perspective." I met her gaze steadily. "Have you, Ivy? That hasn't been my impression these past 5 years." She had the grace to flush slightly. "Perhaps we've had some misunderstandings, but family is so important, don't you think? Especially now that we understand each other better." "I think respect is important," I replied. "Genuine respect, not the kind that appears only after learning someone has financial resources." That lunch ended awkwardly, with Ivy retreating behind brittle politeness, but it established the tone for our interactions going forward. I would be direct and authentic, no longer accommodating disrespect for the sake of family harmony. The situation with the Berkshire's house required immediate attention. As I had suspected, Michael and Ivy were struggling with the carrying costs, the monthly payments consuming an unsustainable portion of their income. After several frank discussions with Michael about their financial situation, I proposed a solution. Mountain Peak Holdings will continue to hold the property, I explained. You and Ivy can remain there with a modified lease agreement that brings the monthly payment in line with what you can reasonably afford. In exchange, you'll oversee some property improvements and maintenance, essentially becoming local managers as well as residents. Michael agreed readily, recognizing the arrangement as more than fair. Ivy was less enthusiastic, but had little choice. Her parents, facing their own financial constraints after some investments had soured, were in no position to help them purchase the property outright. February brought another significant development. After weeks of learning about my business operations, Michael approached me with a proposition. "I'd like to join the business, Mom," he said, his expression serious. "Not as a favor or because of our relationship, but because I think I could add value. My legal background, my connections, my understanding of corporate structures, they could help take Mountain Vista Properties to the next level." I considered his proposal carefully. "What about your law career, the firm partnership track you've been working toward?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture reminiscent of his father. "The truth is, I'm not passionate about corporate law. I never have been. I chose it because it seemed prestigious, because it impressed Ivy and her family. But the work itself, it doesn't fulfill me. And real estate would. I think so. I've enjoyed learning about it these past weeks, more than anything I've done professionally in years. There's something tangible about it creating value, improving properties, building something real." His sincerity was evident, but I needed to be certain. This would mean a significant income reduction, at least initially. "Are you prepared for that, is Ivy?" A shadow crossed his face. "Ivy and I are working through some things. But regardless of how that resolves, this decision is about what I want for my life, my career. I've spent too long making choices to please others." I nodded, understanding completely. "All right, let's structure a trial period. 6 months where you work with the management team, learn the business from the ground up, prove your value before we discuss any formal role or ownership stake." Michael agreed immediately, his enthusiasm evident. The following week, he submitted his resignation to the law firm, explaining that he was joining a family business. By March, he had begun working at the offices of Mountain Vista Properties, starting with the basics of property assessment and renovation planning. His natural intelligence and work ethic served him well. He absorbed information quickly, contributed valuable insights, and earned the respect of the existing management team through humble hard work rather than trading on his relationship to the owner. I watched with growing pride as he rediscovered the values that had shaped his early years: diligence, integrity, and genuine accomplishment, rather than status or appearances. Ivy's reaction to Michael's career change was predictably negative. "A property manager. You left a partnership track position at Sullivan and Moore to become a property manager." Her incredulity echoed through their condominium when he announced his decision. "Not just a property manager," Michael had corrected calmly. "I'm learning all aspects of a substantial real estate investment and management business with the goal of eventually taking on an executive role. In your mother's company, after she deceived us for years, she didn't deceive us, Ivy. She kept her financial situation private, which was her right. And yes, in her company, which is successful by any measure, and aligned with my interests and values, in a way corporate law never was. Their marriage entered a period of serious strain. Ivy, faced with the dual challenges of diminished household income and a husband no longer interested in climbing the social ladder she valued, showed her true colors in ways Michael could no longer ignore. By April, they had begun marriage counseling, though Michael confided in me that he was uncertain about the long-term viability of their relationship. "We married for different reasons," he explained during one of our weekend hikes, a new tradition we'd established. "I thought I loved who she was. She definitely loved who she thought I could become. Neither of us got what we expected. I listened without judgment, offering support without pushing him in any particular direction. This was his journey, his marriage, his decision. My role was to be there for him, regardless of his choices, something I hadn't always managed successfully in recent years." May brought the first family dinner at my home that included both Michael and Ivy since the Christmas revelation. I had recently purchased a new house, not ostentatious, but comfortable, with a lovely garden and enough space for entertaining. It was the first home I'd bought for myself, rather than as an investment, a symbol of my new openness about my financial situation. Ivy arrived with an armful of expensive flowers and a strained smile. "What a lovely home, Georgia. So much nicer than your old place." "Thank you. Though I was perfectly happy in my old house as well," I replied, accepting the flowers. It held so many memories of raising Michael. The dinner was civil, if not warm. Michael worked hard to bridge the conversational gaps, while Ivy maintained a polite facade that occasionally slipped to reveal her underlying resentment. When she made a cutting remark about my secret life as a real estate mogul, Michael responded before I could. "Mom built an impressive business while raising me alone and working full-time as a teacher," he said firmly. "That deserves respect, not sarcasm." Ivy's eyes widened at his rebuke, unused to Michael challenging her. "I was just making conversation," she said defensively. "No, you were being disrespectful." Michael countered his tone, calm but unyielding. "And it needs to stop. My mother deserves better from both of us." That moment marked a turning point in our family dynamic. Michael had publicly established a boundary, making it clear he would no longer tolerate disparagement of me, even from his wife. The remainder of the evening proceeded without incident, though Ivy was noticeably subdued. As spring turned to summer, more changes unfolded. Michael thrived in his new role at Mountain Vista Properties, demonstrating an aptitude for the business that sometimes surprised even me. He had a particular talent for identifying potential property acquisitions and negotiating favorable terms, skills no doubt honed during his years in corporate law. Meanwhile, Ivy struggled to adjust to their new reality. The lifestyle changes necessitated by Michael's career shift, fewer expensive dinners out, more careful budgeting, a scaled-back social calendar, chafed against her expectations. The marriage counseling continued, but Michael confided that they were making little progress in resolving their fundamental differences. "Ivy wants me to go back to the law firm," he told me during a business lunch in June. "She says this real estate phase has gone on long enough." "And what do you want?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "I want to continue what I'm doing. I'm happier than I've been in years, Mom. For the first time since law school, I feel like I'm doing work that matters, that I'm good at, that I enjoy. I don't want to go back to 60-hour weeks of corporate paperwork just to maintain appearances." In July, things came to a head. Ivy delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. Either Michael returned to corporate law and their previous lifestyle, or she would need to reconsider their future together. It was, in essence, a demand that he choose between his authentic self and the version of himself she wanted him to be. Michael chose himself. Their separation was announced quietly. Ivy moved in with her sister temporarily, while they sorted out the details of their divorce. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public scene, just the somber recognition that they had built their marriage on unstable foundations of expectations and appearances, rather than genuine compatibility and respect. I supported Michael through this difficult period without criticizing Ivy directly. This wasn't a time for "I told you so" or vindication, but for compassion and forward focus. When he expressed guilt over the marriage's failure, I reminded him that relationships require effort from both parties, and some fundamental incompatibilities can't be overcome with effort alone. You both entered the marriage with different expectations and values, I said, as we sat on my patio one evening, watching the sunset. That's not entirely either of your faults. Sometimes we don't fully know ourselves, let alone another person, until we've lived with the choices we've made. Michael nodded, sipping his iced tea thoughtfully. I keep thinking about something Dad used to say, that the hardest decisions are usually the right ones. He was a wise man, your father. I agreed, feeling a wave of nostalgia. He would be proud of you for having the courage to make this change, to pursue authenticity, even when it's difficult. As autumn approached, a new normal began to take shape for our family. Michael's divorce was proceeding amicably enough, with both parties seemingly relieved to end a relationship that had become increasingly strained. He had moved into a modest but comfortable apartment near the Mountain Vista offices and was continuing to excel in his role at the company. I had fully embraced my identity as a successful businesswoman, no longer hiding my achievements or wealth. I updated my wardrobe somewhat, not to impress others, but because I enjoyed the freedom of not having to maintain the appearance of living on a teacher's pension. I became more actively involved in community organizations, establishing a scholarship fund for young women interested in business and real estate careers. The Prestons largely disappeared from our lives after Michael and Ivy separated, though Catherine occasionally sent polite but distant messages through mutual acquaintances. I harbored no ill will toward them. Like Ivy, they had simply been operating according to their own values and priorities, which ultimately proved incompatible with ours. By Thanksgiving, Michael had been with Mountain Vista Properties for 9 months, exceeding all expectations for his trial period. We formalized his position as Vice President of Acquisitions, with a clear path toward eventual partnership and partial ownership. This was no nepotistic arrangement, but a recognition of his genuine contributions to the company's growth and success. We celebrated with a small dinner at my new home, just the two of us enjoying a meal. I cooked myself, despite now having the means to hire a chef if I wished. Some habits of modest living remained deeply ingrained, and I found I preferred it that way. Wealth had given me freedom and security, but it hadn't fundamentally changed who I was or what I valued. As we sat before the fireplace after dinner, Michael raised his glass of wine in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to finally seeing each other clearly." I clinked my glass against his. "To truth," I added, "however long it takes us to find it." When Christmas approached, exactly 1 year after the revelation that had changed everything, we decided to celebrate quietly at my home, rather than recreating the formal, tension-filled gathering of the previous year. Michael's divorce had been finalized in November, closing that chapter of his life with what seemed like mutual relief on both sides. On Christmas Eve, as we decorated a modest tree with ornaments collected throughout Michael's childhood, he paused, holding a small handmade star he had crafted in elementary school. "I've been thinking about last Christmas," he said, carefully, hanging the star on a branch, "about how different everything is now." "For the better, I hope?" I asked, passing him another ornament. "Infinitely better," he confirmed without hesitation. "I feel like I've found myself again, Mom. The person I was always meant to be before I got sidetracked trying to be someone else." "I'm glad," I said, simply feeling a deep contentment. "That's all I've ever wanted for you, to be authentically yourself and to find fulfillment in that authenticity." On Christmas morning, we exchanged thoughtful, but not extravagant gifts, enjoying a leisurely breakfast before taking a long walk through the snow-covered neighborhood. The conspicuous consumption and social positioning that had characterized the previous year's celebration were notably absent, replaced by genuine warmth and connection. That evening, as we sat by the fire, with mugs of hot chocolate, a childhood tradition resurrected, Michael brought up something I hadn't expected. "I never properly apologized," he said, looking into the flames rather than at me, "for how I treated you all those years, for being embarrassed by you, for allowing Ivy and her family to disrespect you, for forgetting what you taught me about what really matters." "Michael," I began, but he held up a hand. "Please let me say this. I was wrong, Mom. Deeply wrong. You sacrificed everything to give me a good life, to raise me with solid values, to help me become independent and successful on my own terms. And I repaid that by being ashamed of you because you didn't fit into some artificial social construct that doesn't actually matter." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. "I will regret that for the rest of my life. But I promise you that I've learned from it. I'll never again value appearances over substance or status over genuine character. You taught me better than that, and I forgot the lesson for a while, but I remember it now." I reached over and took his hand, my own eyes misting with tears. "We all make mistakes, Michael. We all get distracted sometimes by the wrong things. What matters is finding our way back to what's true and important. You've done that." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling gently, before Michael spoke again. "Next year will be different for both of us. The business is expanding. You're starting your foundation. I'm rebuilding my life post-divorce. But I'd like one thing to stay the same." "What's that?" I asked. "This," he said, gesturing around us. "Christmas together. Simple, genuine, just family appreciating each other. No pretense, no showing off, no gift exchanges designed to impress or intimidate. Just us being real with each other." I smiled, feeling a deep contentment settle in my heart. I'd like that very much. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on the journey we had taken since that fateful Christmas dinner when I had finally revealed my secret empire. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been hurt feelings, difficult conversations, painful realizations, and significant changes for all involved. But through it all, something precious had been recovered and strengthened. The authentic bond between mother and son, a relationship built on mutual respect, honesty, and shared values rather than obligation or appearances. Michael had found his true path both professionally and personally. I had stepped fully into my identity as a successful businesswoman while maintaining the core values that had guided my life all along. The empire I had built in secret was now in the open, no longer a division between us, but a shared legacy and purpose. More importantly, the pretense and judgment that had characterized our family dynamics for too long had been replaced by authenticity and acceptance. Some might view the dissolution of Michael's marriage as a sad outcome, but I saw it differently. The truth had ultimately set both Michael and Ivy free to pursue lives more aligned with their authentic selves and true priorities. Sometimes, endings are necessary for better beginnings. As for me, I no longer needed to hide my success or diminish myself to make others comfortable. At 63, I had entered a new phase of life, characterized by honesty, purpose, and the quiet confidence that comes from being fully seen and respected for who you truly are. The greatest gift that Christmas had given us wasn't material wealth or social status, but the freedom to be our authentic selves with each other, imperfect, still learning, but genuine in our love and respect. And that, I realized, was worth more than any empire could ever be. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in your family? Or perhaps you've experienced a moment when truth changed everything about a relationship. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes, sharing our experiences helps others find the courage to address difficult situations in their own lives. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to my channel for more real-life experiences, and share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your self-respect and authenticity. Thank you for listening, and remember, true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in relationships built on genuine respect, honesty, and love.